We are all likely familiar with the concept of coincidence. Merriam-Webster defines coincidence as a situation in which events happen at the same time in a way that is not planned or expected. We have all likely witnessed this at some point where two completely unrelated events happen in the same way or at the same time for no reason at all. Now, I'm not here to say that there is no such thing as coincidence. However, I do find that we like to explain things away as coincidence more than is warranted. Making any sort of assumption before deduction is always a bad idea. It will warp your perspective and disable you from tackling the problem from different angles, thereby twisting the facts to suit the assumption that you have made. However, when one assumes coincidence, this is especially dangerous. At times, things do happen with no rhyme or reason at all. However, this should never be an assumption that you have at the beginning. Because when it comes to making deductions, we are trying to attack the problem at every conceivable angle and point of view. That way we can be sure we have covered all of our bases in terms of interpreting the data. One of these points of view is that of coincidence. One should never assume from the beginning that something is a coincidence and thereby rule out the possibility that two things are connected. All the same, one should not rule out the possibility of coincidence, as it is certainly possible. We can be tricked into thinking something is a coincidence on a regular basis when such is not the case. For instance, have you ever been in a situation where you have just learned about something new, be it from school, some infotainment YouTube video, or wherever it is you learn about things?
Hello everyone, welcome to another Top 10. Today we're going to be talking about the Top 10 simple facts. So number 1.
Only to start noticing that subject popping up frequently since you have learned about it. Seemingly by coincidence, something you have recently learned about starts making frequent appearances in your day-to-day life. However, this is simply what happens when your brain encodes information into its database. Because you have deemed this information important for whatever reason, it has been stored into your long-term memory, and thus is now in your mind's database. So when scanning information about your environment as your mind does, it looks for things that might be important. One of the ways it determines this is by cross-referencing what it is seeing with what you have already stored. So before you stored that data in your mind, it was glossed over by this process. But now that you have stored it, your mind now notices it as important. Thus it seems like a coincidence, but in reality it is simply due to how your mind works. This is just one example of a seeming coincidence that turns out to have an explanation. Thus, it is only reasonable to give the information you are observing for a deduction a chance before you jump to the conclusion that it is a coincidence. Speaking of jumping to conclusions, Sherlock the Abominable Bride was finally added to Netflix. Having not had the opportunity to watch it when it first came out, I was overjoyed to find it on Netflix a couple of days ago. Now, after having watched it, some features of interest stood out to me. And if you haven't seen The Abominable Bride yet, be warned, I will be discussing some minor spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this time in the video. So the first feature of interest was, why were the authorities so helpless to solve the case without Holmes' help? The reason being is that they made the pivotal mistake right from the start. They assumed that the bullet that the bride shot was the bullet that killed her. Right from the beginning, they assumed that she was dead when they found her. This would lead them to believe, since a dead woman obviously can't be alive, that the woman had come back as a ghost to kill her husband. However, Holmes from the beginning suspected that she somehow faked her death from the start. This is certainly the more reasonable of the two explanations, as well as the more likely. Furthermore, when Lestrade is confiding in Holmes about the recent murders allegedly perpetrated by the bride, he assumes that the bride has once again risen. Holmes immediately explains his thoughts on the matter, how due to the popularity and mystery surrounding the Ricoletti case, there has been a slew of copycats who are using the image of the bride to cover up their murders, as the police will assume a ghost rather than the usual suspects. Now, why would Scotland Yard assume from the beginning that this is the work of some ghost? Superstition of the times? In part, yes. However, there is more to it than that. The inability to explain a seemingly dead woman killing her husband causes them to jump to the easiest solution, that solution being that she is now a ghost. This is because the brain will always rather take the path of least resistance, and thus we tend to jump to the solution that takes the least work to come up with. As Maria Konnikova states in her book, Mastermind: How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes, our minds love nothing more than jumping to conclusions. So, in essence, bear in mind that jumping to conclusions, whether it be on the basis of coincidence or any other bias you might have, is never a good idea. Always remember to evaluate the evidence before you make a solid statement as to its meaning, because in my experience, first impressions and easy solutions, they rarely tell the whole story.